SITREP World Briefing for August 11, 2026. Colombia's strongest earthquake in decades struck the country's west, killing at least 132 people and injuring hundreds as emergency crews searched collapsed buildings in Cali, Colombia, and other affected areas. Authorities said rescuers were digging through rubble for survivors while many people were still feared trapped, turning Cali into the center of a large-scale response after the powerful tremor damaged homes, streets, and public buildings. President Abelardo de la Espriella declared a state of emergency and promised a concerted rescue effort as the death toll rose. Officials also moved to impose curfews in Cali and Pereira, Colombia, while hospitals and emergency services worked to absorb more than 480 injured people, with one tally putting the number of wounded at 570. Video from the quake showed buildings shaking violently and parts of structures crumbling as the tremor hit western Colombia. The disaster is a major early test for the new administration in Bogotá, because Colombia's Pacific-facing west combines dense urban neighborhoods, vulnerable housing, and difficult transport links that can slow search operations when roads, communications, and local services are disrupted at the same time. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia used North Korean missiles in an overnight strike on Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, an attack that killed at least 6 people and injured 19. The barrage hit the southeastern city as Moscow continued long-range attacks far from the front line. Zelensky has repeatedly warned that cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang is deepening, and he again tied the Zaporizhzhia strike to his appeal for more Western air defense support. Zaporizhzhia is strategically important because it sits near the southern front and remains a major industrial hub, so attacks there carry military as well as civilian consequences. The accusation matters beyond one strike because it points to a supply chain that could help Russia sustain attacks despite years of war and sanctions pressure. If North Korean ballistic missiles are being used regularly against Ukrainian cities, Kyiv is likely to intensify its push for additional interceptors, radars, and ammunition from its allies. Turkey's parliament approved legislation in Ankara on August 10 that creates a conditional, pardon-like path for thousands of Kurdistan Workers' Party or PKK militants to return to civilian life. The measure was presented as a limited amnesty rather than a blanket pardon, and it is intended to support reintegration after a conflict that has shaped Turkish politics, security policy, and relations with the country's Kurdish population for decades. The law opens a formal reintegration mechanism, but it also sets clear limits on who can benefit, excluding jailed PKK members convicted of grave offenses. Ankara is trying to balance negotiations with domestic political pressure, especially from constituencies that view any concession to the PKK through the lens of an insurgency that has cost tens of thousands of lives since the 1980s and repeatedly spilled across Turkey's southeastern provinces and neighboring Iraq and Syria. By moving the bill through parliament, the Turkish government turned what had been a political opening into a concrete legal framework. Any reduction in PKK violence could affect border security, military deployments, and Turkey's broader regional posture, while failure of the process would risk hardening positions again between the state, Kurdish political actors, and armed networks that have long complicated diplomacy and governance inside Turkey. President Donald Trump signed an executive order in Washington on August 10th directing a reduction in recommended childhood vaccinations. The order calls for limiting the routine childhood schedule to 11 immunizations and pushes a broader rethink of school vaccine mandates. This involves federal health agencies, state governments, school systems, and pediatric medical organizations. Trump's order also calls for reconsidering the combined measles, mumps, and rubella shot by promoting the separation of the MMR vaccine into 3 individual injections. School entry rules in the United States are generally enforced by states and local authorities, which may lead to a clash between White House priorities and long-standing public health practices. The order has implications for vaccination requirements, which are part of wider discussions over parental choice, federal authority, and the role of expert agencies in setting national recommendations. The practical consequences will depend on how federal departments, advisory bodies, and state education systems respond in the months ahead. President Donald Trump secretly departed the NATO summit in Ankara last month on an alternate military aircraft after an Iran-related threat, according to reports published on August 11th. The reported switch took place as Trump left Turkey. Both reports said Trump was moved from the usual presidential aircraft plan to another military plane. NATO summits bring together alliance leaders, military planners, intelligence services, and extensive media coverage, so any covert extraction of a U.S. president from the host city carries broader implications for allied coordination, host nation security arrangements, and Washington's assessment of regional escalation risks tied to Iran. The episode is significant because Ankara, Turkey, sits at the intersection of NATO's southern flank, Middle Eastern crisis management, and U.S. relations with both Turkey and Iran. A secret aircraft swap suggests that officials wanted to reduce the chance that an adversary could track, target, or exploit Trump's departure route. Singapore's government raised its 2026 gross domestic product growth forecast to 4.5% to 5.5%, after the economy expanded 5.9% year-on-year in the second quarter. The upgraded outlook from the Ministry of Trade and Industry reflected stronger artificial intelligence-related spending and a less severe than feared economic impact from the Middle East conflict, giving fresh support to one of Asia's most trade-dependent economies and a major global semiconductor and shipping hub. Trade data released alongside the growth update showed that Singapore's key exports climbed 27.4% in the second quarter, propelled by an electronics boom linked to AI demand, while non-oil domestic exports rose 18.6% in the first half of 2026. For Singapore, where manufacturing, logistics, finance, and re-export trade are tightly connected, that export acceleration matters beyond headline numbers because stronger chip, server, and related electronic shipments can feed through to factory output, business investment, and port activity across the island economy. The latest figures reinforce how closely Singapore's near-term performance is tied to shifts in the global technology cycle, especially demand for advanced chips, data center equipment, and other electronics used in AI systems. That matters for policymakers in Singapore because the economy is highly exposed to external shocks, and officials have spent much of the past several years balancing volatile global trade conditions against the need to preserve competitiveness in high-value manufacturing, services, and regional headquarters operations. The stronger second quarter expansion and export gains now give the government a firmer basis for expecting faster full-year growth than it had projected earlier in 2026. The World Health Organization said the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo began about 3 months before officials formally declared the emergency in May, a reassessment that suggests the virus circulated undetected for far longer than first understood. Health authorities said the outbreak has continued to spread, raising the stakes for surveillance, isolation, and contact tracing in a country that has repeatedly confronted deadly Ebola epidemics over the past decade. Health officials launched a new vaccine trial in DR Congo centered on Ervebo, a shot developed against Zaire Ebola virus to examine whether it can offer protection in the current outbreak driven by the Bundibugyo strain. The trial reflects the scientific challenge posed by Ebola's different species. Tools that helped contain earlier outbreaks are not automatically a precise match for every new flare-up. Authorities and researchers are trying to gather evidence quickly enough to shape the response in real time. The backdated timeline and the vaccine study together point to the same problem. The response lost time before the outbreak was fully recognized, and officials are now trying to recover that ground as cases mount. In Eastern and Central Africa, Ebola control depends on rapid laboratory confirmation, trusted local outreach, and safe care for patients and contacts. The WHO assessment now reframes the current emergency as a longer-running outbreak, not a sudden recent shock, and makes the trial's results more consequential for both DR Congo and neighboring states watching for cross-border risk. Sources and the full written briefing are available at sitrepbrief.com.